So with me, I have Julie Michelson, who is a national board certified functional medicine health coach, best-selling author, international speaker, and the host of the Inspired Living with Autoimmunity podcast. Through her journey of overcoming more than a decade of decline with rheumatoid arthritis, Julie became passionate about functional medicine as well as using lifestyle to create healing. Julie is an expert in supporting others achieve the changes necessary to experience true healing. And thank you so much for joining us, Julie.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
You are welcome. I am excited to have you as well. And so we are going to be discussing diet with a focus on autoimmune paleo diet, giving some tips, doing some troubleshooting. And before we dive into this, I would like to just have you talk a little bit about your background, how you became an AIP certified health coach and doing what you do now, helping people with autoimmune conditions. Of course, we said a little bit in the intro because you had rheumatoid arthritis, which I'm sure ties into that.
It does. It does. It's just one of the diagnoses I had when I was in my early 30s, newly single mom with 3 little kiddos. I was diagnosed first with rheumatoid arthritis and was told when I was diagnosed to expect a decline, that there was nothing I could do except take the medications they gave me. And on their end, what they would try to do was slow my decline as much as they could and keep me as comfortable as possible. Unfortunately for me at the time, I believed that. I'd had great doctors. Everybody seemed to agree when you're diagnosed with something like that, that's your fate. And so I, of course, did decline for over a decade because that was what I expected to do. I kept piling on the prescriptions. I was on 10 prescriptions at the end of 11 years at once. Not that I tried 10. I was taking 10 at a time. And it wasn't working. I was unable to work. I was resting while the kids were at school so that I could handle that after school to bedtime window. I had severe brain fog. I was in severe pain. They were trying to get me to put a handicap placard on my car because just to save energy and steps. And that was the current conversation at the time that I luckily had my aha moment, my dark moment, my light moment, whatever you want to call it. And my daughter had come to me, she's my youngest, and just basically begged me, please don't die and leave us. And obviously I couldn't promise her that, but what I said in that moment changed my life and hopefully a lot of people's lives, because this is why I do what I do. And I promised her I would try everything. And in that moment, I realized, I hadn't tried everything. I tried every medication they had me try, thinking that was everything. And luckily, I had the history of a little bit of improvement with diet change that I'd done on my own. And so that was where I started, was with diet. At the point that I made that decision, I was already gluten-free. My son had been diagnosed with celiac a few years before that. And to support him, I went gluten-free with him. Like, look, we'll do it together. And I noticed my joint pain had gotten a little bit better by going gluten-free. Come to find out, I had celiac. But I remember even back then asking my doctor, like, wow, if this helped a little bit, what do you think about dairy? Or I've read that nightshades can be a problem. And she, no, nightshades is 1 in like a million. It's not really a thing. And again, back then I had believed her, but it was enough. I remembered, it was stuck in my head. And that's where I decided to start on my own. And it took me years because I didn't know. AIP wasn't around yet. And I was uneducated. I thought I was eating paleo at that point, and I was still eating corn. I didn't know corn was a grain. I was eating loads of sugar, and I was still avoiding fats, even healthy fats, because I still had that mindset of, fat is bad. So it took a long time. It was a process. And I am really fortunate that without even managing my other underlying causes, just over the years, by continuing to tweak diet and learn, I was able to get well enough to at least reduce the brain fog so I could learn more and continue down the journey. And it has become my life's calling, not only to help people, but to just shout from the rooftops, as you do all the time, that we can heal. That's number one. People need to know that autoimmunity is not a death sentence. It can be turned around.
Well said, and definitely agree. And so your rheumatoid arthritis is under control?
I have no symptoms. I've been symptom free for about 6 years.
Wonderful.
Maybe longer now. Time keeps marching on quickly.
Yeah, that is true. And you mentioned that AIP wasn't around, and same thing when I was diagnosed with Graves' disease in 2008. There was no autoimmune paleo diet then. So really I started out with more of I guess you could say a modified paleo diet. I was still eating nuts, which I actually had to eliminate later on because I was having some issues and wasn't 100% certain it was due to the nuts. But when I cut them out, I kind of progressed further. So why don't we talk about autoimmune paleo? If you could just give maybe a brief overview of what the AIP diet entails.
Absolutely. And I want to start right away by saying, when people hear AIP, they think diet. And we're going to really focus on food today, but AIP is a lifestyle. And so it's important for people to understand that they may dial in their diet perfectly. And if they're not managing their stress, actively managing their stress, if they're not sleeping well, if they're not in community and connected with others, if they're not handling toxins and moving at the proper level for their body, those other, the one thing perfectly without the rest isn't necessarily going to get you the results. I can guarantee you, it won't get you the results you're looking for. We start with, to me, diet's low-hanging fruit and such a big driver. And so number one is not just a diet. Number two, so what autoimmune paleo is, as far as the food plan, it contains a comprehensive elimination diet where we are eliminating all of the most common drivers to autoimmunity. And I say most common because usually by the time most of us are diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, we know we have leaky gut. When we have leaky gut, we've got food sensitivities. A lot of them can be to really healthy, nutrient-dense foods that aren't on an autoimmune list, right? Things like spinach, or I don't know, pick anything. I try to stop saying kale because people are like, I'm tired of hearing about kale. So just know there is no one written plan that's going to be optimal for everybody. But AIP is so comprehensive that we now have great scientific studies behind it. We're removing things, as you mentioned, it's a paleo diet. It's just beyond that. But the key is, and the part that I think gets the most misunderstood, yes, the elimination phase is very restrictive. It's supposed to be a phase. It's not supposed to be a lifelong thing, unless somebody really does need to be avoiding all of those foods long term. So you mentioned paleo. It's completely grain free, and yes, completely grain free. Even oatmeal, these are the things people like to negotiate all the time, and I know we're going to get into that later. But it's grain free. It's sugar free, it's sweetener free, it's, no legumes, nuts, seeds, eggs, nightshades. I'm sure I'm missing alcohol. What else am I missing, Eric?
Yeah, you mentioned what paleo, it allows eggs, it allows nuts, seeds. So you mentioned those are not allowed, and then
no dairy. I didn't say no dairy. No dairy.
Yep, no dairy. Again, you mentioned no nightshades, no grains, no legumes, no alcohol, and of course, it goes without saying, like no unhealthy oils, like certain oils you want to avoid.
Really no processed foods, right? All of those additives and chemicals, and these are things we're talking about, a whole real food eating plan.
And even certain spices are not allowed, correct?
Yes, well, and because a lot of the ones that aren't allowed are either nightshades or they're seeds or not, they're coming from seeds.
Yeah, and we should bring up the coffee. Actually, speaking of the coffee, so
Yes.
I guess what do you say that falls under the legume category? I mean, it's a coffee
It's a
bean or
bean. Yeah, coffee is. It may technically actually be a seed, or I can't remember which category it's in. And again, full confession, I have coffee right here. It's earlier here than it is where you are because I have done my reintroductions, and I am okay with coffee. Although I am not okay with other legumes. I do not eat legumes.
okay. So in your
Yeah.
situation, coffee,
This is
yes,
where,
legumes.
where we start is not where we end up, ideally. And so that restrictive phase is a phase.
Yeah. So yeah, I agree, and I look at just kind of your like you're mentioning. I look at AIP as more of a starting point, and like you said, it's a phase. So when I have someone start on an AIP diet, and again, I can't say I have every single one of my autoimmune patients even start there. Once
We're
again,
the
it depends on
same.
the person.
Yep.
But for those who do start on an AIP diet, I usually will try to encourage them to go at least 3 months. I mean, even if they go 30 days, that's better, obviously, than nothing. But I would say minimum of 3 months. But I'd like to see what you have to say as far as duration of that phase.
And even that, I again, it's individualized. It's going to depend on response. I've had the rare occasion where we're working toward a full AIP elimination and somebody feels phenomenal. So the things they've already eliminated, if somebody's feeling amazing, I'm going to say, okay, then we don't need to get more restrictive. And so I agree. I would say, again, if somebody, it depends on where they are. What are their symptoms like? How long have they been struggling? I think it usually takes at least a good 60 days. And here's the thing I find. I will start with an at least. I don't say 90 days to anybody because I don't want to scare them off. But I do say, this is going to really depend on you. And nobody believes me when I tell them this, but I always tell them in the beginning, that I promise I am going to be encouraging you to do reintroductions. You are not going to want to. And that's the thing. In the beginning, it sounds really hard and it's overwhelming. When it is the right thing and you feel amazing, nobody wants to put those things back in because they don't want to feel crummy again. And so for me, the whole purpose of AIP is information, right? And power. It's not about the elimination, it's about the reintroductions and really learning what each of those foods is doing. People don't understand. I have people ask me all the time, well, are we creating a food sensitivity? Because I've been eating, whatever tomatoes my whole life and they never bothered me, and now they bother. And I'm like, well, wait, but look how sick you were. You couldn't feel specifically. I liken it to, because I am over 50, that fuzzy TV screen that those of us in my age group remember, when the antenna wasn't just right. You have so many little sources that are driving your inflammation. You just can't feel what one is doing. That's the beauty of this protocol or any approach. And I know we may touch on some other eating plans. And the thing I love about, I am working on my Bredesen certification, and I work with a Bredesen certified physician. For those of you who aren't familiar, that's an Alzheimer's plan. Anybody familiar with the Walls protocol? All of these plans come down to the same thing. They're all grain-free, dairy-free, nutrient-dense, loads of veggies, lots of good healthy fats, and figuring out where your inflammation driver and no sugars. They actually, all the higher level of all of these are have some level of ketosis involved. And there's a crossover. And so I study all of them. and see like, okay, these are the things that must be really important no matter what your diagnosis or your symptoms are.
Yeah, I agree. And so I want to talk a little bit about grains because towards the beginning, you picked a little bit on oatmeal. So, and one reason is because before the interview, we were chatting a little bit, and just that's one of the things people like to introduce. People like to introduce oatmeal. Rice is very common. So, as you mentioned, a lot of these diets avoid grains. They recommend for people to avoid grains. So, why is that? Why are grains not part of a AIP diet or a paleo diet or a ketogenic diet? For a ketogenic might be a little bit different because, like you said, like also you're trying to get into ketosis, so there's also
Right.
different reasons too. But I guess
Well, but that is still, I think, still part of it. There's more than one answer, and there's overlap. So we'll start with the easy one, is the keto part, and yes, grains are going to increase your carbs, and at some point for everybody, carbs become inflammatory. So even just that alone, right, without the other reasons, is why somebody who is dealing with chronic inflammation needs to really be careful of their carbs. I have gentled as I've aged. Actually, I've just gentled as I've coached more and more, and I did pick on oatmeal. The reason I picked on oatmeal is because most people think oatmeal's really good for them, right? They're told, it's marketed really well. I had a client recently who was a type 1 diabetic who was eating oatmeal every morning for breakfast. She had no idea that that was bumping her blood sugar. And so, that's easy reason number one, that carbs can be a problem for people. Also, certain grains can, when we're talking about gluten-free grains right now, right? Because gluten's a whole nother thing. And I think everybody that works in the autoimmune world will agree that gluten is a problem, especially for those with autoimmunity. And one of the problems with the other grains is they can be, molecular mimicry is a thing, and they can send similar signals and trip similar immune responses. And so some of those proteins are similar. So that's another piece of the problem. And honestly, and we can get into, you share with me the science behind, I go by what I see. When I first started coaching elimination diets, we would introduce gluten-free grains all lumped together. So I would say, okay, it's gluten-free grain time. And we would do, oats and rice and corn. And I don't do that anymore because we need to know exactly what each particular driver is doing. And I do have clients that are okay with rice at that, when all is said and done, and but even those clients, they can't eat rice every day, or they'll bump their inflammation back up, and so that's where it does become, my kids would tease me, Mom, not all grains are evil. Because I did used to be so like, no, grains are bad. I do see, so the ones that I think sometimes people can eventually handle in moderation would be rice. And again, if you're going to eat rice, cook it, cool it completely, then it becomes a resistant starch, then you can eat it. And maybe a little bit of oats here and there. I don't eat oats. I will occasionally have sushi, but I pour MCT oil on it. So, it really does depend. But corn is one that, through just coaching hundreds of people through this process, corn is a really big problem for people, and they typically have no idea. And that's another reason why I think like the whole gluten-free movement is not that great. I thought it was great when my son was first, before I knew better, because that food is just loaded with junk and high sugar stuff, and loaded with corn.
Yeah, and it's not, some people might say, well, it's organic, so it's GMO free, but it's not just the GMO, it's the corn itself. So even if you have organic corn, still ideally something you want to avoid, arguably not just when trying to restore your health, but really continuously, which is difficult because so many different products, especially if it's packaged and if it's gluten free, usually it's going to have corn.
Yeah. And the one I did leave out too is humans actually weren't created. We were not designed to be able to process grains. So, there's a lot of other, from the way we chew to, there's just a lot of reasons when we look back. And again, if we think of paleo, that's this approach, right? How did we eat in Paleolithic times? What are we designed for? We weren't sitting around eating carbs all day. We weren't sitting around all day either. But that's, if you really actually think of what that mindset means, that's what it means.
Yeah, so they didn't sit around eating popcorn, speaking of corn. Or...
Right. That was we were just joking. My daughter was just teasing me about that when I said I was doing paleo, like all wrong. I was, thought I was eating paleo and I was having popcorn almost every night as like a treat. That was when I had that treat mentality still. So yeah, no, they weren't watching movies and eating popcorn.
So one thing, as far as, like you said, some people might be able to get away with some gluten-free grains, specifically rice and maybe even a little bit oats, and making sure they're cooking it well. But the thing is, you just never know how someone's going to respond. So when someone is trying to negotiate, and obviously it's up to the person. Ultimately, we can't force people to follow any type of diet. We could just give recommendations. But what I tell them is, if you deviate, I mean, it's ultimately up to you, and you might do fine. You might progress fine, but we just don't know. So if that's a risk you want to take, where you go, 30 days or a few months, and then you hit a roadblock. And if you hit a roadblock, we don't know for sure it's because you're eating that food. So if you're eating rice, we don't know if that's why you're not progressing. But if you're eating, let's say, strict AIP, we can't blame it on certain foods. Whereas if you're eating that food, then we don't know.
It's the scientific approach. And that is why I said before, I believe wholeheartedly that the reintroductions, the proper reintroductions, are the most important part, because then you're not guessing what does rice do to me. I just had a client, because I don't always coach AIP straight as it's written. We use it as a framework, which is actually, if you ask even Sarah Ballantyne, I mean, that's what it was designed for, as because in order to be a resource for people, right, you've got to give them the framework. I just had a client reintroduce. This will lead to, I know you have another question in this realm. I had she's now a client. When she was a potential client, she came to me, and we seemed like a great fit until she told me she was vegan. And I said, and I know you have a question about that. I told her I was not the right coach to help her heal unless she was willing to incorporate some animal protein in her diet. And luckily for both of us, she said, I'll do whatever you tell me to do. Let's get started. And as a vegan, some of her really high sensitivities were things like soy and a bunch of the wonderfully nutrient dense vegetables she was eating. And here's where I love the food sensitivity panel, not only as a backup. How do you get a vegan to not eat soy? You show them data that, like, look, your body is really having a problem. For me, it just made that part of my job so much easier. But she just reintroduced kale last week. She's been on elimination for I shouldn't say that. She did a full elimination diet, and has been very slow to reintroduce. And she, was like, please, can we do kale now? Sure. She can't eat kale. It's not her friend, and she loves kale. So it doesn't even have to be what an evil food like my kids think I think. It doesn't have to be, again, on that list of things, but now her body has told her that, right? And she knows, because had she been eating that the whole time, she wouldn't have gotten the results that she got on her elimination phase, because she would have had inflammation being driven the whole time. So like you said, it's so important to take it out and then to really feel. When I did, again, I'm one of those, I get it. Like, I was eating gluten my whole life. I didn't have gut issues. I thought it was fine. When they wanted to test me for celiac, they said, okay, you have to eat 2 pieces of wheat bread a day for, I forget if it was a week or 10 days before they did the biopsy, in order to get an accurate read. And so that's where I learned about reintroductions. I will just leave it at, it didn't happen. I couldn't. I was that sick. So that's that sense of, then your body can really tell you. Had a health coach told me, however many years ago that was, 15 years ago, you shouldn't eat gluten, I probably would have still dabbled in gluten. But feeling what it does to my body, it's a never ever food for me.
Yeah, definitely want to listen to your body. And so one thing I do want to say about the soy, the situation with when the person, like you do a food sensitivity panel and soy comes back positive, but also I guess the one flaw with that, or at least in my opinion, flaw, is that if it comes back negative, like you're not just avoiding soy because
No,
because you're sensitive to it.
which is
There's
why
also
it's on
the
the
lectins in
AIP.
there. Yeah,
Yep,
exactly.
yep,
Yeah.
exactly. And I run into that all the time. I try to explain that I'm doing that panel for extra data. And there's this list I'm looking for the things like kale on that panel, really. And the
So you're looking
ones,
for foods that are allowed on AIP
yes, that
that,
are nutrient dense, that I would normally, encourage you to keep eating. And yeah, so to clarify, I take soy away from everybody all the time. That's not usually when they argue with me a lot about. It's usually more I don't eat much dairy, or I, only eat cheese, or and I will offer to everybody contemplating whether it's AIP or any eating plan, to really take a week and become truly educated about what you are eating. Because what I see is most people really don't. I have had so many people say, oh, I avoid dairy. And there's dairy in the products they're using, even if they're not eating straight dairy. And I'm picking on dairy now. I grew up, my family was in the dairy business. So I love cows. It's not, it's not about that.
yeah,
But
even dark chocolate, which, that's also not allowed on AIP, but some people might still think they're eating just dark chocolate, but some of the dark chocolates will have milk chocolate in there, but it doesn't say so. Like if you look
yes,
at the label, it'll say so, but just
but they'll have casein added, which is a dairy protein. And I just had that very recently with somebody. I'm eating, these dark chocolate keto, whatever. And they're, and I'm like, okay, but what's in them? Oh, there's milk in here. So I would say, if you guys get one takeaway from this conversation today, I think the starting point for everybody is really, really being truly aware of what you are eating, because often we think we're avoiding stuff we're not.
very true. Quick question about the food sensitivity testing. Just
Mhm.
every time I speak with someone, because I personally don't do a lot of food sensitivity testing. Do you do the IgG testing?
I do IgA and IgG, both.
IgA and IgG.
Yep, I do the combo.
So you obviously have them do the blood draw first before doing any type of elimination diet this
You know
way.
what? What we do is, the panel that I use, they'll send a kit right to the house. It's a finger prick test. And so we'll get started. There's plenty to eliminate just on AIP, right? And most of the time, unless somebody is no, I want to go all in right away. We're stepping toward that, whether it's slowly or rapidly anyway. So we get started right away while we're waiting for those results to come back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about constipation, just because that's a common problem where people are used to eating whatever they're eating, whether it's fast food or, again, maybe not eating a lot of unhealthy foods, but they're eating grains, which, just so they might not be going to McDonald's or other fast food restaurants and eating in all the time. But again, they're eating a lot of grains, a lot of legumes, also, and not necessarily a vegan vegetarian, but just a person in general
Right.
who then gives up all these foods, and now all of a sudden they're experiencing constipation. So what tips do you have for them?
I'm going to go way back. I just had this conversation with the physician I work with. Sometimes we forget to start at the beginning. So, number one is, are you drinking enough water? Make sure we kind of like jump to the like, well, what can I take to help me with constipation? But yes, there is often an adjustment period. It is interesting. I don't experience that very often with the clients that I walk through AIP, and it could just be the way we handle that transition into the full elimination. It's very rare, actually, for me, but I know it is a big problem in the AIP community in general. And so, number one, always for anybody, is how much water are you drinking? Are you drinking? We've got to be flushing things out. And so, really look at that first, which again sounds so basic, but is so important. We're increasing, at least, and this could be why I don't see a lot of it in my practice, because we're increasing. It's AIP is we just focus on the elimination phase and what you're avoiding. The other piece, the really important piece, is what you're including. Right, we're including a lot of nutrient dense vegetables, and again, here's that crossover with AIP and walls, and the Bredesen Recode is lots of vegetables and a variety of leafy greens and colors and cruciferous veggies, and so those all have fiber. So, that could be a good reason why we don't see a lot of it. I'm not going to say that, oh, my clients within a week are eating 9 cups of veggies. That's not true. But it is important, and it does help. That's another place where people are like, I need my oatmeal so I can poop. And I'm like, no, we'll find another way. What we use, and I'm not a physician, I work with a physician. Typically, if there's an adjustment period, we encourage people to just make sure they're getting magnesium, and they may have to increase their magnesium intake for a little bit to keep themselves regular, and then typically they can back off, and we look at that as a win-win, because most of us are deficient in magnesium anyway, and there's not a part of your body that doesn't love it. So that's kind of tell me what you do for constipation.
I mean, similar to what you said, just make sure they're well hydrated, eating plenty of vegetables. And like you said, sometimes it can be challenging because initially they're not used to eating a lot of vegetables. And as you also mentioned, they're not just making the transition to like 8, 9 cups of vegetables per day.
Sure.
They might only be having 2 or 3 servings of vegetables per day. And so that, like you said, that could be helpful to increase the vegetable intake. And yeah, magnesium also, I agree. Magnesium, for if you're constipated, like citrate,
or a blend if you don't want to go overboard. We always say, I'm guessing you would do the same, but for those listening that don't know how to figure out how much magnesium to take, it's a very briefly maybe unpleasant process, but you want to keep increasing your dose until you have too much motility, and then you back off by, if you're taking capsules, then you just drop it down 1. That's usually how we do it. And so, but you can do it gently. And the beauty is then you play with it. Like I said, usually once we get that veggie intake up and the body's adjusted, you can drop down. I believe that it's a really important we need magnesium. We all do. That I just think that, and I personally, like, I love blended forms because different parts of the body like different forms of magnesium.
Yeah, and I don't recommend citrate to most of my patients. I was just saying more specific with
Sure.
like
For
constipation and stuff like
motility.
this.
Yes,
But yeah,
absolutely.
I like, magnesium glycinate or glycinate, however you want to pronounce it, and
Yeah.
other forms of magnesium malate. But if just focusing on constipation, then I would say citrate. But I agree
Yeah.
with you. You could also take a blend too. It's not there's
Yeah.
nothing wrong with that. And then I'll also say movement too. Like if someone is
Yes.
sitting around all day, and I had this conversation recently with someone who was also experiencing constipation, shortly after following AIP, and had the same conversation as far as, are you drinking enough water, eating enough vegetables? But it seems like she wasn't moving around enough. And so just, I told her my experience that, like years ago, I was really sluggish. And actually, years ago, I was constant. Like when I was in my early 20s, I would have a bowel movement once or twice a week,
Oh,
just because well, my diet was
sure.
horrible growing up. But, you know, even these days, I have regular bowel movements, but sometimes it's on the more sluggish side. But especially if I'm sitting too much, which I try not to do. I try to be active. I even have a treadmill desk where, I'll do
Love it.
work and I could walk at the same time. So I notice that, if I'm moving and if I'm doing everything else, it's usually not a problem. But if I'm doing everything else and if I'm not moving, that could be a problem when it comes to constipation.
And I'm so glad. See, I'm so glad I asked you because to me, that's one of those often it's like the water, right? Like, but these are things our body needs to be doing. I talked about when we were talking about paleo, right? They were moving all the time. And so whatever that level looks like for you, yeah, it doesn't mean you have to go out and do a, hit workout, but yeah, get up.
Exactly. I don't know how many patients you see with Hashimoto's, Graves' disease. Hashimoto's, of course, is more
I
common.
was going to say, yes, definitely more common. It's such a common crossover. I find whether it's a secondary or a primary diagnosis in autoimmunity. So I would say just definitely about I would say 3/4 of somebody even coming in sharing a different diagnosis also has Hashimoto's.
Yeah,
Not as much with the Graves.
yeah. So I'm bringing that up just because there's controversy with iodine in the world of thyroid health with both Hashimoto's and Graves' disease. So I wanted to get your thoughts about sea vegetables, which are really high in iodine. And do you recommend sea vegetables to your patients with, let's say, Hashimoto's?
I do. I know everybody takes a different path. Um, I again, to me, they're nutrient dense. I believe we do need iodine. I Most of us aren't getting iodine in our diets elsewhere. Hopefully, if they're hopefully not eating iodized salt anymore by the time we're getting going. So we are looking for other good sources to support them. Um, we use labs a lot. I work with a functional medicine physician. I am always, whether it's in my program or with the patients at the clinic, we're always doing labs as well. Um, I think it's easier for I working with the women I work with. One of the things we see a lot, the women who have cystic breasts, they need iodine. And sometimes supporting iodine on them will clear, like, oh my gosh, I've had that my whole life. So we look for signs and we test as well. I don't have people, I certainly don't. Sea vegetables is something that people aren't usually coming in saying, I eat a ton of these. Is that okay? So I think, again, that's not going to be the bulk of somebody's diet. I think it's really good to incorporate.
Okay. So just to confirm, you're not really seeing problems with your Hashimoto's patients as far as sea vegetables go.
We don't. We don't. But again, I think a lot of it comes down to, I mean, how many are they eating? I do, and I'll qualify that. Sometimes he doesn't have Hashimoto's, but he's who popped into mind. I have a client right now who is an avid podcast listener and reader and learner and loves wellness. And for the people who think they should be eating a ton of sea vegetables and are intentionally trying to do something good, that can be a problem. This gentleman was drinking olive oil because it's good for you, right? And he has a really interesting olive oil sensitivity, and it was driving chronic headaches for him. He had no idea. And so everything in balance is what I will say, but I don't have people that really need to be avoiding sea vegetables.
Okay, thanks for that. And so in the last few minutes, I just want to do something I haven't done before, which maybe I'll start.
Oh boy.
But I want to do just like a rapid fire rounds where I just ask some, just pretty much bring up a topic and just have you give like maybe like your opinion in like, let's say 30 seconds or something.
Okay.
Like that. Okay. So
let's do it.
Yeah. So ashwagandha and autoimmune paleo.
I say no.
Because it's a nightshade. It's part of the nightshade
It's
family,
a nightshade. Right? Yep.
How about pea protein powder and AIP?
No, it is a legume.
How about bone broth powder and AIP?
Bone broth and AIP, yes.
I knew you'd say yes to bone broth. So I'm purposely bringing up the powders because there's so many powders, and I'm sure you also get every now and then someone will say, well, I don't really have the time to make bone broth, or I don't like bone broth, but I'll add this bone broth powder to my smoothie.
And I will say what is in your bone broth powder is the trick answer to that trick question. Again, it's about becoming a label reading master. And there are AIP prepared bone broths. I understand not everybody wants to make their own, or back to she still calls herself vegan, my formerly vegan client. I said, you can't say you're vegan when you eat salmon 5 days a week or 4 days a week and drink bone broth and eat eggs. So you're no longer a vegan. If you can't handle chicken feet, there are reasons. I would never ask her to make her own bone broth. And she hasn't jumped to the beef world yet, but you've got to read your ingredients and know what's in there.
Okay. Sounds good. And then what's your favorite cooking oil?
Depends on what I'm cooking and how. I love avocado oil. To me, it's a middle of the road oil. In the sense that it doesn't, taste like coconut. It doesn't have an intense flavor. It's very mild, and it can handle a higher heat than olive oil. I don't like cooking with olive oil. I like dressing with olive oil. But coconut oil as well we use.
Awesome. And chlorella and spirulina and AIP.
Again, this is where it's a non-answer. It's an individual thing. I really am a fan of chlorella. I mentioned I occasionally eat sushi. I will take chlorella when I eat sushi to try to bind some of those nasty things. You've got to know. It depends, because it's going to depend on your autoimmune pathways as to whether you can handle certain things or not. Those are typically not over revving or a problem for people. And again, it's almost like the sea vegetable question, because there's such good stuff in both of those things that for the most part people can handle it. But I would be aware. I would take them almost like an introduction. I would take them when you're feeling well and you're eating clean and you see how your body feels about it.
Yeah, I bring it up because I'm pretty sure Sarah Ballantyne says not to eat. It's on our yes, no, maybe list. I'm pretty sure it's no on that
Yeah.
with. So I just wanted to get your opinion. How about AIP and ghee, autoimmune paleo and ghee, which I asked you about when you interviewed me for your
Yep.
podcast.
Yep. So you like this, you must get this question a lot. Um, if you don't have, so the answer is yes. We allow ghee. If you don't have, if you know you have a dairy allergy, don't do ghee. But the proteins are gone. And so it's one of the ways to make AIP more successful for people is to allow them to have ghee. And I almost added it in my list of cooking oils, but I don't know if it's an oil.
Okay, and this will be the last rapid fire question. So reintroducing gluten and dairy if remission has been achieved.
Yes. I believe everybody should reintroduce everything. Gluten and dairy, absolutely the last two on the list. And actually, when I have people reintroduce dairy, I have them do different dairies at different times. So I'll have them do, a goat separate from cow, because some people can, again, it could maybe goat might be an occasional food for someone and cow may be a never. But I want people to feel what it does so that 6 months later, they don't end up at a birthday party where, oops, they had the birthday cake and, it was loaded with gluten and sugar and dairy. And now they're in a flare and they have no idea which it was. So I do believe everybody should reintroduce everything. And then I will reiterate, because I have to. And then I believe they should avoid gluten for the rest of their lives.
Okay, that was the next question, because I didn't expect that response. But then I was going to ask, so how about if they reintroduce gluten and they feel perfectly fine? You would still say
I cry. It has happened to me literally twice out of hundreds of people. It's very rare. And I cry, and then then I explain, we review leaky gut and autoimmunity and how this all happened to begin with, and leave it on. I still remember you talking about, but I think you said it was a gluten-free pizza, the occasional, we for them, I say, have a little gluten in Italy. Maybe it seems to be less of a problem there, but don't make it a part of your regular diet.
All right. Well, thanks for that. And I know we're just about out of time, but are there anything I didn't ask that I should have asked, or any last words you want to give someone who, like, if someone's thinking about following AIP, if they're not sure they'll be able to stick with it? Any last words?
I would say it can sound overwhelming and be way easier than you think once you get into it. And because the key is, and I think we might have talked about this on my podcast, as you make changes, you start to feel better. You have more energy to make more changes. It's not, which is why ripping off the Band-Aid, so to speak, and just jumping in from a standard American diet to a full AIP elimination, probably not going to work. But look for support. Whether it's, have somebody do it with you, find a coach. This is why there are coaches, and because you want to really be supported through that process. But I would say take one, if you're thinking of it, but it seems overwhelming, and you're still eating gluten, then go gluten-free. Like, just take one step, look at the elimination plan. I always tell people, start with the easiest thing. What's the easiest thing they think they can eliminate successfully, so that they can start to build some momentum?
All right. Well, thanks for that. And finally, how can people learn more about you and your services, Julie?
Absolutely. The best, easiest place to find me is jm.coach. And that can then take you either to my free mini course, to my website, my social handles, my podcast. So it's kind of my little gateway there to anything you might want to know. So jm.coach or juliemichelson.com if you want to go straight to the website.
Great. And again, the name of your podcast, Inspired Living with Autoimmunity, correct?
Correct. So come check it out. We did a great episode there. So if you need a little more Dr. Eric, come check out my podcast and listen to that episode.
Yeah, that was fun. And this was fun too. We'll have to do it again in the future. And thank you so much for taking the time to share your thoughts on AIP as well as other aspects related to the diet.
Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy chatting with you.